Half-Brothers Betrayal, the affair that led to bloodshed, criminal story. The sprawling house on Maple Street was a picture of suburban tranquility. Its white picket fence, perfectly manicured lawn, and the smell of fresh-cut grass in the summer created an illusion of perfection that everyone could see, but few understood. Inside, the family's life seemed to fit the image they projected: warm, welcoming, and full of love. Maria and Ricardo, though not perfect parents, provided stability for their children. Lucas and Emma, the half-siblings, grew up in a world where nothing seemed amiss. Their parents had wed when they were both in their 20s, young and hopeful. Maria had been Ricardo's second wife, and Lucas, a product of their brief marriage, was always the focus of his attention. Emma, on the other hand, was the daughter of Ricardo's first wife, who had passed away when Emma was only 6. Before we can continue, if you love crime stories, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Lucas had always been the star of the family, handsome, charismatic, and driven. He had inherited his father's sharp business sense and was already on a path to success in the competitive world of real estate by the time he turned 25. His smile could light up a room, and his quick wit made him the life of any party. People respected him, admired him, and often sought his advice. Even in the world of his family, Lucas was the one everyone turned to. His relationship with Emma, while seemingly close, was filled with the complexities of being raised together, but with different biological parents. There were occasional moments of tension, but these were often brushed aside under the guise of familial love and loyalty. Emma, now in her mid-20s, had always lived in her older brother's shadow. She was quieter, more introspective, and less interested in the superficial trappings of success that Lucas so easily attracted. She had a steady job as a librarian at the local public library and lived a simple life. She didn't crave the limelight or the accolades Lucas seemed to earn with minimal effort. Her beauty was more understated, soft and delicate, but not the kind that drew attention unless you took the time to look. Unlike Lucas, she avoided attention, preferring her books and solitude to socializing. But despite her quieter personality, she loved her brother deeply, and they shared an easy camaraderie. Their childhood had been marked by laughter and shared memories, and though their relationship was not without its awkward moments, Emma always felt that they were family, unbreakable, loyal, and enduring. The family dinners were a central fixture of their lives. Every Sunday, Maria would cook her famous lasagna or roast chicken, and the family would gather around the large oak dining table. There were sometimes heated debates over politics or religion, but there was always an unspoken rule: these disagreements would never reach the point of rupture. The ties that bound the family together, for all their cracks and imperfections, were stronger than any temporary conflict. This was a family who forgave, who overlooked flaws, who let small transgressions slide because, at the end of the day, blood was thicker than water. But underneath the routine, there was a quiet tension, a subtle undercurrent that no one dared to address. Ricardo, now in his late 50s, was a quiet man. He had spent most of his life working tirelessly to provide for his family. A self-made man, he'd built his real estate business from the ground up, but now, as he entered the later years of his life, he found himself increasingly distant from his wife and children. Maria, in her early 50s, had been a stay-at-home mother for much of her life, raising the children with care, but her marriage had begun to stagnate. There were nights when she would stay up late, alone in their bedroom, wondering if the life she had built was truly fulfilling or if she was simply going through the motions. The spark between her and Ricardo had long faded, and their marriage had become a series of routines, quiet, almost robotic. The void in their relationship was something Maria had learned to live with, but it didn't stop her from noticing the dynamic between her children. Emma and Lucas, though not full siblings, shared an undeniable bond that transcended biological ties. And yet, there was something about their relationship that always seemed to hang in the air like an unspoken secret. It wasn't anything overt, no glaring signs of rivalry or resentment, but it was there. Perhaps it was because, for all of Lucas's outward confidence and charm, there was something fragile underneath. And Emma, for all her quiet grace, had always looked up to him, seeking his approval more than she ever admitted. But there was another layer to the family dynamic that only Lucas and Emma knew, and that was their relationship with Samuel, Emma's full-blooded brother. Samuel had always been an outsider of sorts in the family, and not because of any fault of his own. He was quieter than Lucas, less assertive, but there was an intensity in Samuel that was hard to ignore. He had never quite fit the mold that his father had set for the family. He was not a businessman, not someone who sought out attention. His career was more modest. He worked as a mechanic, doing repairs on cars and trucks, finding satisfaction in the simplicity of his work. Samuel was a good man, dependable, but he lacked the sharpness Lucas had. He was the kind of person who kept his thoughts to himself, never revealing much about what was happening inside his head. Lucas had always had a strange affection for Samuel. He respected him, but there was an underlying tension. Samuel's quiet demeanor had a way of making Lucas feel inadequate. Perhaps it was because Samuel seemed content with the life he had, while Lucas always felt the pressure to achieve more. It was a silent competition, one that neither of them fully understood. But what bothered Lucas more than anything was the closeness Samuel shared with his wife, Jessica. Jessica was everything Lucas was not. She was effortlessly beautiful, full of life, and completely disarming. She had a way of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. But there was something about her that intrigued Lucas more than he was willing to admit. She wasn't just attractive, she was charismatic, intelligent, and sharp. She had married Samuel years earlier, and while their relationship was never without its issues, there was no denying the chemistry they shared. To Lucas, their bond seemed unbreakable, and it frustrated him. He couldn't understand why Jessica, who had so much to offer, would be married to someone like Samuel. In the quiet moments, when the family gathered for dinner or drinks, Lucas would often find himself staring at Jessica, noticing the way she laughed at Samuel's jokes or the way she touched his arm when they spoke. It made Lucas uncomfortable, though he would never show it. He told himself it was just jealousy, nothing more. After all, he was happily married to someone else, and the idea of getting involved with Jessica was absurd. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more between them, something deeper than just polite conversation. Jessica, for her part, was no stranger to attention. She had always been the center of any gathering, charming everyone with her beauty and charisma. She and Lucas had a unique connection, one that neither had quite understood at the time. There were fleeting moments when their eyes would meet across the room and something unspoken would pass between them. But Jessica never entertained the thought of an affair, not at first. She loved Samuel, or at least she thought she did. Yet, as time passed, the attraction between Jessica and Lucas grew. It started innocently, small gestures, lingering touches, shared glances, but soon it became more. There was a chemistry between them that neither could deny. And while Lucas might have tried to convince himself it was just a passing infatuation, deep down, he knew it was something more. The tension that simmered beneath the surface began to take over, consuming them both. In the comfort of their shared family life, beneath the surface of these seemingly innocent interactions, the cracks began to form. It was only a matter of time before the comfortable facade they had all carefully constructed would shatter, leaving behind a legacy of betrayal that no one could have foreseen. But in the meantime, Lucas and Jessica would continue their dance of stolen moments, their secrets building like a ticking time bomb, waiting for the moment when everything would explode. And none of them, least of all Samuel, had any idea what was coming. At first, it was innocent, a fleeting touch, a lingering glance. Just the kind of thing that could be brushed off as nothing more than casual interaction between two people who had known each other for years. But as the months passed, the underlying tension between Lucas and Jessica grew in ways neither could have predicted. Their secret flirtations began to evolve into something deeper, something far more dangerous, even though neither of them dared to voice it. What had once been innocent moments of connection began to take on an intensity that neither could ignore. It all started on a quiet evening during one of the many family dinners. The table was set with Maria's homemade lasagna, Samuel at the head of the table, Emma quietly helping her mother pass around the dishes. The house smelled of garlic and fresh basil, the warm light of the chandelier above casting a soft glow over the room. It was a scene that had played out countless times before. But this evening, something was different. As the evening unfolded, Lucas found himself inexplicably drawn to Jessica. He could feel her presence more keenly tonight, the way her laughter seemed to echo in his chest, her every movement pulling at something deep inside him. Their eyes met across the table as Samuel made one of his usual dry jokes, and in that brief instant, something passed between them. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a shared understanding, an unspoken invitation. The moment lingered in the air like a heavy perfume, and Lucas couldn't shake the sensation that something had shifted. For the first time in months, he couldn't stop thinking about her. And this time, the thoughts weren't about casual banter or family gatherings, but something more, something forbidden. Jessica, too, felt it, though she tried desperately to push it aside. She had been married to Samuel for 5 years now, and while their marriage wasn't without its struggles, she had never once considered that her loyalty could be in question. Samuel was a good man. He worked hard, he loved her in his quiet way, and though their passion had cooled over time, there was a deep affection between them. He was her rock, dependable and steady. He didn't ask much of her, and she had always been content with the life they built together, until Lucas entered the picture. It was never Lucas's fault. At least, Jessica told herself that. He was just charming. There was no denying that. Lucas had always been the center of attention at family gatherings, the one everyone gravitated toward, the one with the perfect smile and the easy way of making people feel important. He was used to getting what he wanted, and his ability to do so was intoxicating. He exuded confidence effortlessly, a confidence that, until recently, had never stirred anything more than admiration in Jessica. But now she was questioning everything. It was on one of those late summer nights, when the family gathered at the house for a quiet evening of wine and conversation, that the first crack in their carefully maintained facades appeared. Samuel had gone to bed early, citing work the next morning, leaving Jessica and Lucas alone on the back porch. The evening was warm, the sound of crickets and the occasional car passing by the only background noise. A bottle of red wine sat between them, their glasses half full. The conversation had started innocuously enough, as it always did, talk about the weather, family gossip, and trivial things that kept the evening light. But as the wine flowed, the conversation shifted. Jessica found herself laughing a little too loudly at one of Lucas's jokes, her face flushed with the alcohol and his attention. She leaned forward slightly as he spoke, her eyes locked onto his. For the first time, she noticed the way his jawline tightened when he was passionate about a subject, the way his hands moved when he tried to emphasize a point. The chemistry between them was palpable, and Jessica couldn't ignore it any longer. Lucas was no longer just Lucas. He was someone who made her feel alive in a way that Samuel no longer did. The attraction was there, undeniable and raw. But it wasn't just physical. There was something deeper, something emotional, that caught Jessica off guard. When she spoke to Lucas, she felt seen, truly seen, in a way that she hadn't felt in years. He listened intently, his eyes never leaving hers, as though her thoughts and feelings were the only things that mattered. It was this attention that made her feel wanted, desired, not just for her appearance, but for who she was. Samuel had always been a good listener, but he was a man of few words. Their conversations had become routine, predictable, and over time, the silence between them had grown comfortable, even soothing. But now, with Lucas, there was an edge to everything, an energy that Jessica had forgotten existed. The following week, it happened. The family had decided to take a weekend trip to a cabin by the lake, an old tradition they had kept up for years. Samuel and Jessica drove separately from Lucas and Emma, but that didn't stop the spark from igniting. The cabin was nestled in a quiet corner of the woods, surrounded by towering pine trees that provided a sense of seclusion. The air smelled of pine and fresh water, and the sky was an endless blue that stretched above them. The weekend was supposed to be filled with hiking, barbecues, and time spent outdoors, but it became a playground for Lucas and Jessica's growing connection. On the first night, after a long hike through the woods, the group gathered around a campfire. The warmth of the flames contrasted with the chill of the night air, and everyone relaxed into the moment. But it was as the fire burned low and the others had drifted off to bed that things began to shift. Jessica and Lucas found themselves alone at the fire pit, the crackling of the embers the only sound between them. The conversation started light, but it quickly deepened, as it always did when they were together. Lucas, ever the charmer, made her laugh again, his smile flashing in the firelight. He had that effect on her, he always did. And as they talked about their shared memories, the laughter died down, leaving behind a silence that felt different from any other silence they had shared before. The weight of their proximity, the heat of the fire, and the alcohol they had both consumed made everything feel heightened. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither one of them spoke. Jessica could feel her heart racing, her breath shallow. She could see the way Lucas's eyes softened, how he wasn't looking at her with amusement anymore but with something deeper, something more intimate. And then, without thinking, Jessica reached out, her fingers brushing against Lucas's. The touch was brief, but electrifying. Lucas's breath hitched, and his hand moved instinctively to hers. He didn't pull away, neither did she. The connection was undeniable, and as their hands intertwined, the world outside of that moment seemed to disappear. They leaned in closer, and in a heartbeat, their lips met, softly at first, then with more urgency. The kiss was everything Jessica had known she had been missing. It was passionate, intense, and full of longing. For that fleeting moment, Jessica didn't care about the consequences, the betrayal, or the family they were about to tear apart. All she could think about was the overwhelming sensation of being wanted, of being seen by someone who made her feel like she was more than just a wife, more than just Samuel's partner. She felt alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. But as quickly as it began, the kiss ended. They pulled away from each other, breathless and shaken. The gravity of what had just happened was too much to ignore. Jessica's heart raced, but her mind was clouded with guilt. She quickly stood up, backing away from Lucas as if distance could erase what they had just shared. She mumbled something about needing to check on Samuel, but the words felt hollow. What could she say? What had just happened could not be undone. Lucas watched her walk away, the weight of their moment hanging in the air between them. That night, neither of them slept. Jessica lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the cabin, replaying the kiss over and over in her mind. She could still feel the heat of Lucas's lips on hers, the overwhelming sense of connection that had flooded her veins. But she also felt the crushing weight of guilt. She had betrayed Samuel. No matter how she tried to justify it, she knew that what she had done was wrong. Lucas, too, was restless. He tossed and turned in the darkness, haunted by the taste of Jessica's kiss. It was everything he had imagined, and yet more than he had ever expected. He had wanted her, of course, but now that he had crossed the line, he realized that nothing would ever be the same again. Their lives had changed in that one moment, and neither of them knew how to go back. And so, the affair began, quietly, in secret, but with an intensity that neither Lucas nor Jessica could contain. They knew what they were doing was wrong, but the allure of each other was impossible to resist. What had started as a forbidden attraction had now become an uncontrollable desire that would soon unravel everything. The air had a certain crispness to it that autumn morning, a change that Lucas and Jessica both felt, albeit for different reasons. The scent of fresh coffee and freshly baked bread filled the house, mingling with the sound of quiet chatter and laughter from the kitchen. It was a usual Sunday morning in the Martins' home. One of those moments where everything seemed to be going according to plan, where the family was gathered around the table, talking about their week. It was peaceful, predictable, but in the back of Jessica's mind, there was an underlying sense of something more, something unspoken that kept tugging at her thoughts. She had tried not to think about it, of course. Who could blame her? The affair with Lucas was still very new, still very much a secret, and every part of her told her that it should remain that way. It was just a brief distraction, a momentary lapse in judgment, something she would get over. At least, that's what she told herself. But the truth was that Jessica couldn't seem to stop thinking about him. And every time she saw him, whether in a crowded room or across the table, it felt like there was an invisible pull between them. It was subtle at first, just an occasional lingering glance, a word or two exchanged with a little more emphasis than necessary. It made her pulse quicken, made her laugh a little too loudly at his jokes, made her feel a little too excited to be near him. She could feel it growing, like a small fire that was getting harder to ignore. The thing was, Lucas wasn't making it easy for her to pretend it wasn't happening. He was charming, she already knew that. It wasn't a new quality. But lately, his charm had felt different. There was a glint in his eye, a certain way he looked at her whe. And they spoke, as though he knew something she didn't. And somehow, she wasn't sure she wanted to know what that was. The moment they were alone, really alone, came a few days later during one of those quiet family weekends at the countryside house. The Martins liked to escape to their family retreat, a charming little cottage in the woods that they used for weekend getaways. It was cozy and familiar, exactly the kind of place that offered comfort, the type of retreat people needed when life became a bit too busy. Everyone had agreed to go for a relaxing weekend away from the city. Lucas, Jessica, Samuel, Emma, everybody. The first evening, as everyone gathered around the fireplace, Jessica felt a warmth that had little to do with the crackling logs. The fire glowed softly, illuminating everyone's faces in that familiar, intimate way that only family could create. Samuel and Emma were sitting across from each other, talking about an upcoming family event, their voices steady and filled with the kind of quiet affection that had become routine over the years. But Jessica wasn't focused on them. She was focused on Lucas. They were seated next to each other, their knees occasionally brushing beneath the table. At first, it had seemed like a harmless touch, just the kind of accidental brush that happened when people sat too close. But when it happened again, and this time with more intent, Jessica couldn't deny that it made her heart skip a beat. She stole a glance at him, just for a second. He was looking at her, too. And suddenly, everything around them, the warmth of the fire, the low murmur of voices, seemed to fade into the background. There was just the two of them, connected by a subtle, unspoken understanding. He smiled, a small, knowing smile that made Jessica's stomach flutter. Her heart raced as she quickly looked away, trying to play it off as if it hadn't happened, as if her mind wasn't racing with possibilities. But Lucas wasn't letting it go so easily. He leaned closer, just enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath against her ear. His voice was low, barely above a whisper. "I think we're alone," he said, his tone teasing, but there was a trace of something else in it, something more earnest, more hopeful than Jessica cared to admit. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt a strange mix of exhilaration and anxiety swirl in her chest. It was as if her body knew what her mind had been trying to suppress. There was a part of her that was terrified of what this could mean, but there was also a part of her that was curious. Curious about the forbidden, about the unknown. "Stop," she murmured, shaking her head, though there was no real force behind the words. "We shouldn't do this." But there was a smile on her lips, and a part of her didn't want to stop. She didn't know what to make of it. What was happening? Was she really considering this? And why did it feel so tempting? Lucas's hand found hers under the table, a simple gesture, but it made her heart skip once more. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They both knew this moment had come, and no words could erase the tension that had built up between them over the past few weeks. A light touch, the briefest of caresses, but it spoke volumes. Jessica took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "We can't," she began, but the words felt hollow, as if she were trying to convince herself more than him. "Why not?" Lucas asked, his voice gentle but persistent. He was looking at her with that same glimmer in his eyes, the kind of gaze that made it hard to resist. "Nothing's wrong, Jessica. It's just us here. Just a moment. No one will know." It wasn't that Jessica didn't trust him, but the weight of everything they had to lose felt heavy on her shoulders. Samuel, her husband, her partner, had never done anything to deserve this. He had been nothing but kind to her. But as the evenings stretched on, the attraction, the undeniable chemistry, kept pulling her back to him. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, too. There was something in the way he made her feel alive, seen. Still, Jessica knew they were playing with fire. She had already crossed a line by allowing these thoughts to take root in her mind. She had let the spark between them grow into something bigger than she ever expected, and now she was afraid of what would happen if she let it burn any brighter. As the night wore on, the family retreated to their respective rooms. Lucas and Jessica exchanged a few more glances, but this time, there was no touch, no whispered words. The temptation was there, though, pulsing in the background. And though neither of them said a word, they both knew something had shifted. The possibility was no longer just an idea. It was real. And it felt as if it were only a matter of time before it would happen. Later, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Jessica found herself thinking about what Lucas had said. Nothing's wrong. It's just a moment. Was it really just a moment? Was it something she could control, or was she already too far gone? She tossed and turned, the uncertainty gnawing at her, as sleep eluded her. The next few days were filled with the same tension, the same unspoken connection that simmered between them. It was both thrilling and terrifying. The lines they had drawn around themselves seemed to blur with every passing day. And so, Jessica found herself at the crossroads she had feared. She couldn't pretend this was nothing, not anymore. The feelings were real. But what were they going to do about it? Was she willing to risk everything for a moment of desire, for something that was still so uncertain? That was the question that would hang over her for the rest of the weekend. And for much longer, perhaps. The days that followed the weekend at the Martins family cabin were a blur of suppressed emotions and careful calculations. Jessica could feel the change in the air as she moved through her routine, as if the world had shifted slightly out of alignment. She had always prided herself on being able to manage her emotions, to keep a cool and collected exterior no matter what was happening inside. But now, everything felt different. Every glance, every word between her and Lucas seemed laden with meaning. The space between them, once familiar and comfortable, had grown heavy with the weight of their secret. At home, Samuel had noticed nothing out of the ordinary. He was still as steady and predictable as ever, his routine unchanged, his attention focused on the things that had always mattered to him: work, family, and the occasional lazy Sunday afternoon. Jessica had grown so used to his presence that it was almost comforting. Samuel was the anchor in her life, the one who made her feel safe and secure. He was her partner, in every sense of the word. And yet, the further she went down this road with Lucas, the more she began to question whether her life with Samuel had ever been as fulfilling as she had believed. Jessica's guilt was a constant companion. She would catch herself staring at Samuel during dinner, or when they were watching a movie together on the couch, and a wave of shame would wash over her. How could she do this to him? How could she betray the man who had been nothing but loyal, the one who trusted her implicitly? Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the image of Samuel's face, the face of the man who loved her, across the dinner table, smiling, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. But no matter how hard she tried to suppress the growing guilt, there was another feeling that kept rising within her: desire. The more she spent time with Lucas, the more she found herself drawn to him, not just physically but emotionally as well. He was exciting. He was unpredictable. And, somehow, he had become an escape from the monotony of her everyday life. Their stolen moments, their brief exchanges, felt like a secret world where they could be anyone, anywhere. But it was a world built on lies, a world that couldn't last. The first few weeks after the weekend at the cabin passed in a haze of stolen glances, lingering touches, and whispered conversations. Jessica couldn't help but look for Lucas in every room, every gathering. Their interactions were brief, little more than a look exchanged across the dinner table, or a moment of contact when they bumped into each other in the hallway. But each of those moments felt like a spark, a flicker of something more. Each time Lucas smiled at her, his eyes meeting hers in that knowing way, she felt a flutter in her chest that she couldn't deny. Lucas, for his part, seemed just as caught up in their newfound connection. He would go out of his way to find moments when they could be alone, if only for a few seconds. He would stop her in the hallway, catch her gaze as they passed each other in the kitchen, or linger just a little longer than necessary when he offered to help with some mundane task. But it was in those quiet, unnoticed moments that the tension grew. It wasn't just physical attraction anymore. It was a silent understanding, an unspoken bond that neither of them could ignore. At first, Jessica told herself it was harmless. After all, it was just a few stolen moments, nothing more, nothing less. It was the kind of harmless flirtation that could easily be dismissed as nothing more than a passing fancy. But as the days wore on, she realized it was becoming something more, a deeper connection that had begun to creep into every corner of her life. One evening, after dinner, when everyone was relaxing in the living room, Lucas found himself sitting next to Jessica on the couch. Samuel was in the other room, chatting with Emma about work, his back turned, unaware of the charged atmosphere that was building between Jessica and Lucas. Jessica could feel the warmth of his body next to hers, the subtle, almost imperceptible pressure of his leg brushing against hers. It was enough to make her heart beat faster. She tried to focus on the conversation happening in front of her, but her attention kept drifting. She caught Lucas's eye and saw that same look he had given her so many times before. The look that made her wonder if he could see right through her, if he knew exactly what was going on in her mind. "Are you all right?" Lucas whispered, his voice low and smooth, sending a shiver down her spine. Jessica turned to look at him, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, and she hated how easily she gave in to him. How easily she allowed herself to be drawn in by the magnetic pull between them. She nodded, though the smile she gave him felt forced. "I'm fine," she said, though she knew it was a lie. She wasn't fine. Not at all. Lucas leaned in slightly, his proximity almost overwhelming. "You don't look fine," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Something's on your mind." Jessica felt a flicker of panic rise within her. Could he sense it? Could he see how much she was struggling? She quickly glanced over at Samuel, still absorbed in his conversation with Emma, before turning back to Lucas. She wanted to pull away, to push him out of her space, but something kept her glued to the spot. "I'm just tired," she said, the lie rolling off her tongue so easily that it almost felt like truth. Lucas didn't press her any further. Instead, he just smiled, an almost imperceptible quirk of his lips, and leaned back into the couch, giving her space, though the tension between them still simmered beneath the surface. But it wasn't long before the weight of their secret started to feel too much to bear. Jessica found herself growing increasingly restless, always on edge, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. She would have moments of clarity when she realized how reckless they were being, how dangerous it was to continue this. But then Lucas would send her a text, a simple "thinking of you," or a playful comment, and all her resolve would crumble. The affair was starting to consume her, and she didn't know how to stop it. It was only a matter of time before Samuel began to notice. He wasn't oblivious. And while Jessica had convinced herself that they were being careful, that they were keeping things under control, she knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. The tension between her and Lucas was no longer something she could easily ignore. The way they spoke to each other, the way they exchanged subtle touches, it was becoming impossible to hide. And if Samuel ever caught wind of it, everything would change. Jessica had always believed that she could control the situation, that she could keep everything in balance. But the truth was, she was losing control. She was beginning to feel like a stranger in her own life, trapped between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. One afternoon, a few weeks after that evening on the couch, Jessica found herself alone with Lucas in the kitchen. It was a quiet moment, just the two of them, and the air between them felt charged, like a live wire. She knew that what was happening was dangerous. She knew it in her gut, but she couldn't bring herself to pull away. The attraction, the connection, it was too powerful, too consuming. Lucas was leaning against the counter, a cup of coffee in his hands. His eyes were on her, steady and unwavering. There was no pretension in his gaze, no games. Just the raw intensity of someone who knew exactly what they wanted. "I can't keep doing this," Jessica said, her voice low, but steady. "I can't keep pretending like everything's fine. This isn't who I am." Lucas set his coffee cup down with a soft clink, his gaze never leaving hers. "Then why are we still doing this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica didn't have an answer. For the first time in weeks, she felt the weight of her actions fully, felt the full extent of the consequences pressing down on her. This wasn't just about her and Lucas anymore. It wasn't just a harmless affair or a fleeting distraction. It was real. It was complicated. And no matter how hard she tried to convince herself otherwise, she couldn't escape the truth. Things were changing, and there was no going back. For the longest time, Jessica had tried to convince herself that she could stop. That this affair, this growing attraction between her and Lucas, was something fleeting, something she could control. She thought that if she could just keep her distance, if she could avoid the private moments where the temptation would be too great, everything would eventually settle down. She told herself that the feelings would fade. But the truth was far more complicated. The feelings, the desire, had only deepened. They had become something she couldn't escape, something she didn't know how to manage. The weekend getaway to the beach house had been the tipping point. It was supposed to be a simple family vacation, an escape from the demands of work and daily life. But as soon as Jessica arrived, she knew it would be different. There was something in the air, something electric, something that neither she nor Lucas could deny. It had been growing for weeks. The stolen glances, the brief touches, the moments of shared laughter that felt just a little too intimate. It was as if the whole world had faded away, leaving only the two of them in a bubble where the rules of reality no longer applied. On the first evening at the beach house, the family gathered for dinner. The house was cozy, with large windows that offered a panoramic view of the ocean. The sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the background, a soft, rhythmic melody that seemed to mirror the nervous thrum in Jessica's chest. She watched Lucas as he interacted with everyone, laughing, joking, and contributing to the conversation as though everything were perfectly normal. But Jessica could feel the tension between them, as if the air around them had thickened. Every time their eyes met, it felt like an electric charge shot through her, making her pulse quicken. After dinner, when the rest of the family was relaxing in the living room, Lucas approached her under the pretext of offering her a drink. He leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but filled with a quiet urgency. Jessica's heart fluttered, and for a brief moment, she considered running, going to Samuel or Emma to put some distance between herself and Lucas. But something inside her, a deep, almost primal instinct, kept her rooted to the spot. "You've wanted this," she told herself. "You've been waiting for this moment." "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She knew what he wanted, and she knew what she wanted too. In that moment, the weight of their secret no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like a freedom, a liberation. All the tension, all the stolen moments, had led up to this. Lucas guided her outside to the deck, away from the others, where the evening air was cool and refreshing. The sound of the waves was louder here, crashing against the rocks below the cliff, as if the ocean itself were echoing the rush of her heartbeat. Once they were alone, Jessica turned to him, her mind racing. She had always known that this moment would come. She had always known that sooner or later, their secret would no longer be enough. She couldn't help but wonder if this was a point of no return. If they crossed this line, there would be no going back. But as she looked into Lucas's eyes, his intense, dark gaze, she felt a surge of something stronger than reason. She felt desire, a raw, consuming need. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling, unsure whether she was asking for his reassurance or her own. Lucas stepped closer, his body almost touching hers. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said, his words laced with quiet conviction. "This is what we both want." Before she could say anything else, Lucas leaned in and kissed her. It was soft at first, gentle, tentative, but as the kiss deepened, Everything else faded away. The house, the family, Samuel,
Emma.
It was as if nothing existed but the two of them, locked in this moment that they had both been longing for. There was no hesitation in Lucas's movements, no second thoughts. Just a quiet certainty that this was where they were supposed to be. When they finally broke apart, Jessica's mind was spinning. Part of her was elated, intoxicated by the rush of passion and excitement that flooded her. But another part of her, the part that was still tethered to reality, felt a gnawing sense of dread. What had she done? What would this mean for her marriage? For Samuel? But before she could voice her concerns, Lucas spoke again, his voice soft but steady. We don't have to think about anything else right now. All that matters is what we want, right? His words resonated with her. She didn't want to think about the consequences. Not yet, anyway. In that moment, all she wanted was to be with him, to feel the way he made her feel. Alive, desired, wanted. And so, for the rest of the evening, they kept the facade of normalcy. They returned to the others, joined in the conversations, laughed at the jokes, and pretended that everything was fine. But underneath it all, Jessica knew that nothing was the same anymore. Over the next few days, they continued their secret trysts, stealing moments when no one was around. The guilt, the fear, the shame, they all remained, lingering in the background like a storm cloud. But at the same time, the excitement of being together, of experiencing something forbidden, made her feel more alive than she had in years. It was as if a part of her that had been dormant for so long had woken up, and there was no going back to the life she had before. It was an intoxicating feeling. The danger of their secret made everything feel more intense. Very touch, every kiss, every stolen word felt like an act of rebellion. They were no longer just two people in a family setting. They were two people bound together by something deeper, something that neither of them could fully articulate but both knew was real. But just as quickly as the excitement had built, it began to unravel. Lucas's behavior started to change. He became possessive, more insistent, pushing Jessica to spend more time with him, to take more risks. He began texting her constantly, sending her messages in the middle of the day, asking her when they could meet, when they could talk. He started to make it feel as though she was the one holding them back, the one who needed to decide whether she was truly committed to this. Jessica had always been someone who prided herself on being in control. She had worked hard for the life she had with Samuel, the family they had built, the security they shared. But now, in the face of Lucas's mounting pressure, she started to feel as though she were losing herself. The lines between what she wanted and what was right began to blur. Was this really who she was? Was this really the person she had become? But Lucas wasn't giving her time to think. He wanted more of her time, more of her attention, more of everything. It wasn't enough for him to have these brief, stolen moments. He wanted her completely, and as his need for her grew, so did Jessica's uncertainty. She had never thought of herself as someone who could be swept up in such a whirlwind of passion. She had never imagined that she would allow herself to be so consumed by desire, by something so reckless. As the days passed, Jessica found herself at a crossroads. She had gotten exactly what she wanted. She had crossed the line she had once believed to be uncrossable. She had embraced the thrill, the passion, the intensity that had long been missing from her marriage. She had given in to the forbidden, and for a brief moment, it felt like victory. But as the rush of the affair began to lose its luster, as the reality of what she had done began to settle in, she realized that the victory had been false. The life she had known, the life she had built, was slipping away from her. The price of this affair, this momentary indulgence, was far higher than she had ever anticipated. And now, with the consequences looming large on the horizon, Jessica could no longer deny it. She had gotten what she wanted, but at what cost? The days after the weekend at the beach house felt like a slow, deliberate descent into chaos. Jessica had spent years maintaining control over every aspect of her life. She was the woman who had built a perfect home, a perfect marriage, who had successfully managed to juggle family, work, and personal commitments with grace. But all that had come crumbling down the moment she crossed the line with Lucas. She had thought she could control the consequences, keep her secret locked away, but now, the price of her betrayal was beginning to reveal itself in ways she could never have anticipated. It started subtly, small moments of unease, things that had once been so familiar to her now felt unfamiliar. The tension in the house between her and Samuel was palpable, though he had not yet caught on to the affair. He had always been a steady, dependable man. When he looked at her, there was still that same tenderness, that same trust. But Jessica could feel herself distancing from him, her guilt a constant weight that hung in the air. His affection felt suffocating now, his gaze too knowing. Every time he touched her, every time he spoke to her, it felt like a lie. But it wasn't just Samuel who began to notice the shift. Emma, Samuel's younger sister, had always been close with Jessica, and their friendship had been one of the few constants in her life. Yet, recently, Jessica had felt a growing sense of alienation between them. Emma's sharp eyes seemed to be noticing more, her questions more probing, her silence more filled with suspicion. The subtle changes in Jessica's behavior, a distracted look, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, didn't go unnoticed. Jessica felt the pressure mounting, like a slow, suffocating wave. She couldn't keep this up for much longer. The first real crack came one evening, as Jessica prepared dinner while Samuel and Emma talked in the other room. Lucas had texted her, something innocuous, a joke about the family gathering. But the moment she read the text, something inside her snapped. The secret they had been living with for so long now felt like a looming, jagged rock she could no longer ignore. She had always thought she could control it, continue the affair in quiet, stolen moments, keeping it separate from the rest of her life. But Lucas had begun pressing her. He had started suggesting that they go away for weekends, to leave the family behind, to be together without the burden of hiding. His requests, his demands had become more insistent. She didn't know how to say no. The excitement, the rush of being with him, had dulled her sense of reality, her sense of what was truly important. And now it felt like everything was falling apart. As she stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, her hands trembling slightly, she heard Samuel's voice from the other room, raised in frustration. "Jessica," he called, his tone unusual, laced with a tension she hadn't heard before. She turned, her heart leaping in her chest. "Yes, we need to talk," he said, and his words were quiet but firm. Jessica's stomach dropped. It wasn't the first time Samuel had said those words. He had always been the type to have serious discussions when he felt there was something on his mind. But this time, the weight behind his words was different. This time, she could feel that the conversation would be about something far deeper than any minor disagreement. She walked into the living room, her pulse racing. Emma was sitting on the couch, her eyes focused on the floor, an air of discomfort surrounding her. Samuel stood in front of her, his arms crossed, his brow furrowed. He looked tired, as if he had been holding something in for days. "Is something wrong?" Jessica asked, her voice sounding more nervous than she intended. "Do you want to explain this?" Samuel asked, his voice tight, as he held up his phone. Jessica's heart stopped as she saw the open messages on the screen, the text between her and Lucas. The way they spoke to each other, the hidden affection, the longing, the flirtation that had once felt harmless now stared back at her in cold, glaring truth. "You think I don't see it? You think I don't notice?" Samuel's voice trembled with disbelief. The room felt as though it were closing in on her. She had thought she would be able to control the situation, to keep it hidden for just a little while longer. But it was clear now that her world was unraveling, and there was no way to stop it. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words felt like they were lodged in her throat. How could she explain? How could she justify what she had done? How could she look her husband in the eyes, the man who had trusted her for so many years, and tell him that she had betrayed him in the worst way possible? I'm sorry," she whispered, but the apology felt empty, hollow. "I didn't mean for this to happen." But Samuel wasn't listening anymore. His face, once full of love and warmth, was now contorted with anger and hurt. He shook his head, his eyes red with frustration. "How long, Jessica?" he asked. "How long has this been going on?" How long have you been lying to me?" She wanted to say something to explain, something that would make it better, something that would make him understand. But there was nothing. The affair wasn't something that could be explained away, nor was it something that could be undone. Lucas's name on her lips had broken something inside her, something she wasn't sure could ever be repaired. The damage wasn't just to her marriage. It wasn't just the betrayal of trust between her and Samuel. It was the destruction of something far more fundamental, her sense of who she was. As Samuel stormed out of the room, his anger like a storm that threatened to tear through everything in its path, Emma stood up slowly. She had been silent throughout the entire exchange, but now her voice cut through the room like a knife. "How could you do this, Jess?" Emma's words were soft, almost a whisper, but they carried an undercurrent of shock and betrayal. "You're not just hurting Samuel. You're hurting all of us. You're hurting yourself." And those words, those simple, painful words, hit Jessica harder than anything Samuel had said. Because she knew Emma was right. She had hurt everyone. She had hurt the people she loved most. And now, she was left standing in the ruins of her own choices, unsure of what to do next. That night, as Jessica lay in bed, she replayed the scene in her mind over and over again. The way Samuel had looked at her, the hurt in his eyes, the finality in Emma's voice. The weight of the betrayal settled deeper into her bones. The truth was inescapable. She had paid the price for her actions, and there was no going back. The following days were a blur. Samuel had withdrawn from her completely, refusing to speak to her, avoiding her gaze whenever they passed each other in the house. Emma, too, had distanced herself, no longer speaking to Jessica with the same warmth. The family that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a battlefield. The walls of their home seemed to close in on Jessica, and she couldn't escape the suffocating feeling of guilt that weighed on her chest. And then came the conversation with Lucas. She had avoided him for as long as she could, but eventually, she couldn't avoid him any longer. She met him at a cafe, the same place where they had shared their first secret kiss, and sat across from him, her heart heavy with regret. "I can't do this anymore," Jessica said, her voice breaking. "I can't keep living this lie." Lucas stared at her, his face unreadable. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone colder than she had ever heard it. "I mean, I can't keep being with you," she said. This affair, it's destroying everything. It's not worth it anymore." For a moment, there was silence between them. Lucas's expression hardened, but there was something in his eyes that made Jessica feel as though he was disappointed, not in her, but in the idea of what they had been. He had never considered the fallout. He had never thought about the damage they would cause. To him, it had always been about the thrill, the forbidden nature of their relationship, but now, she saw that it had become something more destructive, something beyond their control. "You'll regret this," Lucas said, his voice low. "You can't just walk away. This isn't over." But Jessica had already made her choice. She was done. And as she left the cafe, a sense of emptiness washed over her. She had broken everything, lost everything. And for what? For a moment of passion? For a feeling of excitement that had quickly turned to ash? The heavy price had been paid. The days that followed felt like a blur to Jessica, disjointed and full of sharp edges. Her life, once so predictable and controlled, now felt like a shattered mirror, with pieces scattered around her, impossible to put back together in any way that made sense. She had hurt the people she loved most. Samuel, the man who had been her rock for years, was distant, emotionally closed off, and angry. Emma, the friend she had considered her closest confidant, was cold, her eyes now filled with a mixture of disbelief and quiet judgment. And Lucas, the man who had once seemed like the key to her escape, had now become a bitter reminder of everything that had gone wrong. It was an irony she couldn't escape. The very thing she had wanted so desperately, a moment of passion, of freedom, of living without the constraints of responsibility, had come at the cost of everything she held dear. And now, with the truth fully out in the open, there was no going back. There was only the slow, painful process of trying to rebuild the pieces of her life and accepting the irrevocable damage that had been done. But there was also a strange, unsettling sense of clarity that had settled over Jessica in the days following the confrontation. She had paid a heavy price for her actions, as she had come to understand in the aftermath, but it wasn't just the consequences of the affair itself that weighed on her. It was the profound shift within herself, the awareness that she was no longer the woman she had been before the affair, and that in some ways, she might never be that person again. The weeks after the confrontation with Samuel were agonizingly silent. They had avoided speaking much. Their once effortless conversations had become strained, and every word felt like an attempt to traverse a vast chasm that had opened up between them. Samuel had withdrawn, emotionally distant, unwilling to engage with Jessica in any meaningful way. He was angry, no, furious, but more than that, he was hurt. And Jessica couldn't blame him. She had betrayed him, and no amount of apologies could undo that. At night, when she lay in bed, the weight of her guilt suffocating her, she found herself wondering if things could ever go back to how they had been. Could she ever rebuild the trust that had been shattered? Could Samuel ever forgive her, truly forgive her, for what she had done? Or would they be forever bound by this fracture in their relationship, a crack that would always remain, no matter how much they tried to mend it? It was a thought that kept her awake at night, and it gnawed at her during the day as well. She tried to reach out to Samuel, tried to apologize, tried to explain that it had been a momentary lapse in judgment, that it had never been about him, about their marriage. But every time she did, she was met with a silence that only deepened the rift between them. Days turned into weeks, and Jessica began to feel the isolation settling into her bones. It wasn't just the distance between her and Samuel, it was the distance between her and the person she had once been. The woman who had been so sure of herself, so in control, was no longer recognizable to her. She had given in to something reckless, something that had destroyed her sense of self and shattered the life she had worked so hard to build. And now, there was no escaping the emptiness that lingered in her heart. The worst part of it all, however, was the knowledge that she had betrayed not just Samuel, but herself. She had always prided herself on being a woman of integrity, a woman who could navigate life with honesty and purpose. But the affair had stripped her of that. It had shown her the darkness that existed within her, the vulnerability she had been unwilling to face. And in many ways, that was the hardest truth to accept, that she had been complicit in her own moral decay. One afternoon, as Jessica sat alone in the kitchen, her hands resting idly on the countertop, she heard a knock at the door. It was the first time in days that anyone had come by, and she felt a mix of hope and dread. She opened the door, and to her surprise, it was Emma standing there, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. "Can I come in?" Emma asked, her voice soft, but with an edge of caution. Jessica nodded silently and stepped aside to let her in. As Emma entered the living room, Jessica could feel the weight of the conversation that was about to unfold. She had always known that Emma was disappointed in her, but now, standing before her, she could see the depth of that disappointment in her eyes. Emma didn't sit down immediately. Instead, she stood there, her gaze fixed on Jessica, as if she were trying to find the words that would convey everything that had been left unsaid. "You know," Emma began slowly, her voice tight, "it's not just Samuel who's hurting because of this." Jessica winced. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing it aloud, spoken by the person who had once been her closest friend, was a different kind of pain. She had lost her marriage, yes, but she had also lost the trust of someone who had been there for her through everything. Emma had been a sister to her, and now, she was a stranger. "I never expected this from you, Jess," Emma continued. "Not in a million years. I always thought you were different, that you had more integrity than this. But now, I'm not sure who you are anymore." Jessica felt her heart constrict in her chest. Emma's words stung, but they were not untrue. She had betrayed her best friend just as much as she had betrayed Samuel, and the guilt of it was suffocating. "I'm sorry, Emma," Jessica whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen." Emma's expression softened slightly, but there was still a distance between them that Jessica couldn't bridge. I know you didn't mean to hurt anyone, but you did. And now we all have to deal with the fallout. I just don't know if I can forgive you for this. Jessica felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she fought them back. She couldn't let herself break down in front of Emma, not again. She had cried enough tears to last a lifetime, but none of them had undone the damage. None of them had healed the wounds she had caused. I understand, Jessica said quietly. I don't expect you to forgive me right now, Emma. I don't even know if I can forgive myself. The silence that followed was heavy, as if the weight of everything that had been said hung in the air between them. Finally, Emma broke the silence. You know, Jess, Emma said, her voice softer now. I want to believe that you can change, that you can learn from this. But it's going to take time. A lot of time. And I don't know if I can be the person who helps you through it. Jessica nodded. She didn't expect Emma to help her. She wasn't even sure she could help herself. But she knew one thing for certain. The path to redemption, if there was one, would not be easy.
It would take time.
It would take patience. And it would take a lot of work to rebuild the trust she had shattered, not just with others, but with herself. After Emma left, Jessica sat in the living room, feeling the weight of everything that had been said. The conversation had been hard, painful even, but it had been a wake-up call. She had to face the reality of her actions, and she couldn't run from them anymore. She couldn't hide behind excuses or rationalizations. The truth was, she had made choices, and those choices had consequences. As the days turned into weeks, Jessica began to do the hard work of trying to rebuild her life. She attended therapy, trying to understand the root of her actions, trying to grasp why she had betrayed the people she loved. She reached out to Samuel, though he remained emotionally distant, and tried to show him, through small acts of kindness and honesty, that she was truly sorry for what she had done. It wasn't easy. It wasn't even close to being easy. The road to healing was long and full of setbacks, but Jessica had learned one important lesson. Change wasn't something that could be done overnight. It was a process, slow, painful, and sometimes discouraging, but it was the only path forward. The house was quieter now. The silence between her and Samuel was still thick, and their relationship had yet to heal. But Jessica had changed. She was no longer the woman who had made reckless decisions without thinking about the consequences. She had come to understand that redemption wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about accepting responsibility for the brokenness and learning to live with it. And so, she returned to her familiar situation, this time with a new truth. She had learned the hard way that actions have consequences. She had lost a part of herself, but perhaps, in the process, she had found a new version of herself. One who understood the weight of her choices and was willing to face the consequences of them, no matter how long it took.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.